Britain's tax office just admitted in writing to members of Parliament that it has been overcharging pensioners on their state pension for 15 years. Not accused of it, not suspected of it, admitted it in a formal letter signed by the chief executive of HMRC himself. 1.4 million pensioners were overtaxed in the last tax year alone. And this didn't start last year. It started in 2010, and it has been quietly running in the background of British life ever since, growing bigger every single year that nobody caught it. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how the organization responsible for collecting Britain's taxes correctly got its own maths wrong for a decade and a half, why it only admitted it after getting caught, and why the pensioners it overcharged still have to fight to get their own money back. Here's the number that should stop you. In the 2024 to 25 tax year alone, 1.4 million pensioners paid too much tax through the PAYE system because of this single error. That's already a lot of people. But look at how fast it's been growing. The year before, it was 1.17 million. The year before that, 762,000. In 3 years, the number of pensioners caught up in this has nearly doubled. And PAYE is only one part of it. HMRC's own letter to MP states that up to 955,000 more pensioners filing self-assessment returns and a further 760,000 using simple assessment may also have been charged incorrectly in that same year. Add all of that together, and you are looking at a problem that has, in a single recent tax year, touched something in the region of 3 million pensioners across the country. This is not a one-off clerical mistake from last spring. This is a structural fault that has been sitting inside the system HMRC uses to calculate what pensioners owe since the 2010 to 11 tax year. 15 years. Multiple governments. Multiple chancellors. Multiple rounds of state pension increases. And through all of it, the same underlying error quietly running in the background every single April. It also lands on a group already being pulled into the tax system in growing numbers. A larger share of people over 65 are now paying income tax than at almost any point in recent memory, as frozen tax thresholds combine with years of state pension increases under the triple lock to pull more and more retirees over the personal allowance. So this isn't an error affecting a small, shrinking pool of people at the margins of the tax system. It's landing on an already growing population of tax-paying pensioners at the exact moment more of them than ever are being drawn into paying tax on an income that was never supposed to be complicated to calculate correctly. So how does a government tax authority get its own sums wrong for 15 years without noticing? The mechanism itself is almost absurdly small, and that's exactly what makes it so revealing. The state pension rises every year under the triple lock, the rule that guarantees it increases by whichever is highest out of inflation, average earnings growth, or 2.5%. That new, higher rate doesn't kick in on the first day of a tax year. It kicks in from the first Monday after the 5th of April, because payments are made in arrears on a fixed day of the week. HMRC's own guidance says that when working out how much tax someone owes on their state pension, the calculation should use 51 weeks at the new, higher rate and 1 single week at the old, lower rate to account for that short gap at the start of the year. 1 week. That's the entire mechanism. HMRC's own system, since a change made back in 2010, has not been applying that 1 week adjustment correctly. Instead of the correct 51 weeks and 1 week split, pensioners have in many cases effectively been taxed, as if the new higher rate applied for the full year from day one, which means they're taxed on slightly more income than they actually received. Multiply one small miscalculated week by the state pension by every affected pensioner, by every year since 2010, and you get a national total running into the millions of pounds. In the 2024 to 25 tax year alone, HMRC collected more than £2 million in extra tax directly because of this error. Here's how HMRC itself has chosen to describe the scale of it. A spokesperson said the organization is confident most state pensioners have not been affected, and that for those who have, the impact is small, typically only a few pounds difference in tax paid per year. Taken in isolation, that's technically true. The average overpayment per person in 2024 to 25 was around £2. £2. That is the number HMRC wants you to focus on. But £2 multiplied by 1.4 million people in a single year is only part of the picture, because this hasn't been happening for 1 year. It's been happening every year since 2010 to 11. 15 tax years of small individual overpayments, compounding across a growing pensioner population, adds up to a very different number than the one in that press line. One tax expert put the contradiction plainly. The amounts involved might look small to any one person, but with a problem of this size touching this many people, it means the government has effectively been topped up by money it was never entitled to collect. Marx has said the underlying fault will be corrected this summer, so that the 2025 to 26 tax year onward should calculate this correctly. Notice what that promise actually covers, though. It fixes the system going forward. It says nothing about automatically putting right the 15 years that came before it. And the £2 million collected in 2024 to 25 is only a snapshot of the most recent year HMRC has actually disclosed a figure for. The error itself is 15 years old, and the number of pensioners it has touched has been climbing steadily, from 762,000 to 1.17 million to 1.4 million in just the 3 years HMRC has published numbers for. Nobody outside HMRC has been given a comparable figure for the earlier years of the error, which means the true scale of what's been collected since 2010 to 11 simply isn't public information yet. Here's the part that should genuinely bother you more than the maths itself. HMRC did not discover this error through its own internal auditing. It did not come forward voluntarily to Parliament out of a sense of transparency. The error was uncovered by a tax columnist at the Telegraph, who began investigating irregularities in how pensioners' tax was being calculated and published his findings in May of this year. It was only after that investigation and the public scrutiny that followed it that HMRC's chief executive, John Paul Marks, wrote a formal letter of apology to the chairman of the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee, admitting the scale of the problem. Think about what that timeline actually means. A miscalculation that has existed since 2010 was only formally acknowledged in 2026, 16 years later, and only because a journalist happened to go looking. Nobody at HMRC stood up and said, "We found a mistake, let's fix it and tell people." The mistake was found by someone outside the organization, and HMRC's admission followed the exposure, not the other way around. The same columnist who broke the story didn't mince his words about what he found on the inside. He described a state of chaos at HMRC over the issue, with pensioners left confused and overtaxed as a result. And here's the twist inside the twist. Even now, having admitted the error in writing to Parliament, HMRC has not committed to automatically refunding a single pensioner who was overcharged. The reason given is that the amounts fall within what's called administrative tolerances, a technical threshold below which HMRC doesn't consider it worth the resource to proactively correct. What that means in plain English is this. The tax office got its own calculation wrong for 15 years, took the extra money without telling anyone, and has now decided that fixing it automatically isn't a priority. If you were one of the pensioners affected, the money HMRC admits it wasn't entitled to charge you sits with HMRC indefinitely, unless you personally contact them and ask for it back. This is also not the first time this exact pattern has played out. The same Telegraph columnist who broke this story previously helped expose a separate scandal in which around 300,000 women had been shortchanged on their state pension for years, a problem that was denied by the government minister responsible at the time and only resolved after sustained media pressure and the work of a backbench MP. Different error, same institution, same pattern. A mistake goes unacknowledged for years, gets found by someone outside the system, and only then gets addressed, and even then only partially. Now put a face to the £2. Picture a woman in her late 70s, living alone on her state pension and a small workplace pension on top of it, the kind of income where every direct debit is planned around what's left after the essentials. She has been slightly overtaxed on her state pension every single year since roughly 2011, without ever being told, without any letter flagging an inconsistency, without any reason to suspect that the number on her tax code wasn't exactly right. She trusted it. The same way most people trust a payslip or a pension statement, because checking it yourself would mean understanding a calculation that even HMRC's own systems couldn't get right for a decade and a half. £2 a year sounds trivial until you multiply it by 15 years, and then multiply that by however many other small miscalculations may have stacked up alongside it over a decade and a half of a state pension income being quietly recalculated in the background. For someone on a fixed income, the number was never really the point. The point is that she had no way of knowing, no way of checking, and no realistic path to catching this herself. The only reason anyone in her position finds out today is if they happen to see a news story, recognize themselves in it, and decide to make a phone call HMRC has given them no obligation to make easy. That is what makes this different from an ordinary billing error. If a private company had systematically overcharged 15 years' worth of customers quietly and only admitted it after being caught by a journalist, and then refused to automatically refund anyone, it would be treated as a scandal. When the organization doing it is the one legally entitled to take your money directly out of your pension before you ever see it, there's no ombudsman phone call to make, no different provider to switch to. You simply trust that the number is right, because you have no real alternative. And it isn't only the pensioners themselves who are left carrying this. Picture their adult children, the ones who help an elderly parent manage their post each month, who now have to explain a story this technical to someone who has never had a reason to distrust a tax code in their life. Explaining that the tax office quietly overcharged them for over a decade, that no one was ever going to tell them, and that getting it back means a phone call and a wait is its own small, exhausting task layered on top of everything else that comes with looking after an aging parent's finances. Here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. The state pension is meant to be the one part of retirement income people don't have to think about. It's not a private pension you have to manage or a savings pot you have to monitor. It is administered, calculated, and taxed by the government on the explicit understanding that it will be done correctly, because pensioners are not expected to audit the tax office themselves. For 15 years, that basic assumption quietly stopped being true, and nobody responsible for it said a word until someone outside the system forced the issue into public view. The individual amounts here are small. Nobody is claiming otherwise, not even the pensioners affected. But an organization with the legal authority to take money directly from millions of retirement incomes, getting its own sums wrong for a decade and a half, only admitting it under pressure, and then leaving the burden of correction on the very people it overcharged, says something about how much scrutiny sits behind the numbers on your tax code that most people simply assume are correct. This also isn't happening in isolation. It's the second time in recent years that a Telegraph investigation has had to force a government department to admit it had been shortchanging pensioners for years on a completely separate error in a completely separate part of the system. Two different mistakes, two different mechanisms, one shared pattern. Retirees quietly receiving less than they were owed or paying more than they should have for years at a stretch until outside pressure finally made the correction happen. The question isn't really about £2 a year. It's about how many other quiet miscalculations are sitting inside a tax system this complicated, running unnoticed, until a journalist happens to go looking. If you're a pensioner or you have a parent or grandparent drawing a state pension, this is worth an actual phone call to HMRC to check, not just a video to watch and move on from. Would you have ever found out about this if the media hadn't exposed it? Tell me below. I read every comment.